The morning started like any other for Jake Roberts. He woke up at 5:30 just like he had every day for the past 8 years. His small wooden cabin sat quietly on the side of Pine Mountain, far away from the noise and problems of the city below. The only sounds were birds singing and wind moving through the tall trees. Jake had built this life on purpose. After his marriage fell apart and he lost his construction business, he decided he was done with people. Done with their lies, their broken promises, and their endless drama. Up here in the Montana mountains, life was simple. Hunt for food, fish in the clear streams, and fix whatever needed fixing around his cabin. No cell phone towers, no neighbors asking for favors, and definitely no one telling him what to do. He pulled on his heavy boots and thick jacket. February in Montana was brutal. The temperature outside was probably 20 degrees below zero, and snow covered everything as far as he could see. But Jake had learned to love the cold. It kept the weekend hikers away and made sure he stayed completely alone. After drinking his black coffee and eating some leftover deer meat, Jake grabbed his rifle and headed out to check his trap lines. He had set up snares and traps along a 3-mile route through the forest. This was how he caught rabbits, squirrels, and sometimes bigger animals for food. It was also how he made a little money by selling fur pelts in town twice a month. The snow crunched under his boots as he walked. His familiar path. The first trap was empty. So was the second one. Jake didn't mind. Some days were better than others. That's just how life worked up here. He had learned to be patient and accept whatever nature gave him, but as he approached the third trap, something felt different. The forest was too quiet. Even the birds had stopped singing. Jake stopped walking and listened carefully. His years in the wilderness had taught him to pay attention to small changes. Something was wrong. Then he heard it. A soft crying sound, almost like a hurt animal. But this didn't sound like any animal Jake knew. It sounded human. More specifically, it sounded like children crying. Jake's first thought was that some stupid family had gotten lost while camping. It happened sometimes, even in winter. City people who thought they could handle the mountains but had no idea what they were doing. Usually Jake would just ignore them and let the forest teach them a lesson. But children were different. Even Jake, who had given up on most of humanity, couldn't ignore crying children. He followed the sound, moving carefully through the thick trees. The crying got louder as he got closer. Jake could now hear voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize. Definitely not English. Maybe Spanish? But it didn't sound quite right for Spanish either. Jake pushed through a group of pine trees and suddenly stopped. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. In a small clearing, 4 people huddled together against a large fallen tree. A woman who looked to be in her 30s was lying on the snow, her leg bent at a weird angle. She was clearly in terrible pain. 3 small children sat close to her, all of them shaking from the cold. But these weren't lost campers. Their clothes were thin and completely wrong for mountain weather. The woman wore a light jacket that wouldn't keep anyone warm in this kind of cold. The children had on what looked like regular school clothes, thin pants, light shoes, and jackets that might be okay for a cool day in the city, but were useless against Montana winter. All 4 of them looked like they hadn't eaten in days, maybe weeks. Their faces were thin and pale. The children's lips were blue from cold, and Jake could see they were all suffering from frostbite on their fingers and toes. The woman had black hair and features that made Jake think she might be Asian. Chinese maybe, or Korean. The children looked like her, so probably her kids. But what were Chinese people doing alone in the Montana wilderness in the middle of winter? Jake stood there for a moment, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then the oldest child, a girl, who looked about 9 years old, noticed him. Her eyes went wide with fear. She said something quickly in their language to the woman, who tried to sit up despite her injured leg. When the woman saw Jake standing there with his rifle, her face filled with terror. She started speaking rapidly, her voice full of panic. Jake couldn't understand the words, but her tone was clear. She was begging, pleading for something. The little girl grabbed her mother's arm and spoke in broken English. "Please, mister, don't hurt us. We very sorry." Jake realized what was happening. These people thought he was going to kill them. They were so scared they could barely speak. The woman kept trying to pull her children behind her, as if she could protect them even though she couldn't even stand up. Hey, Jake said softly, holding up his free hand. "I'm not going to hurt you." But his words only seemed to make them more afraid. The woman said something that sounded like, "Bu Yao Sha women," over and over again. Jake didn't speak Chinese, but he could tell she was begging for their lives. The middle child, a boy who looked about 7, was crying quietly. The youngest, maybe 4 years old, wasn't even crying anymore. He just stared at Jake with empty eyes, too weak and cold to show much emotion. Jake slowly put his rifle down on the ground and stepped back. "Look, I'm putting the gun down. See, I'm not going to hurt anyone." The little girl translated for her mother, but the woman still looked terrified. Jake could see that all 4 of them were in serious trouble. The woman's leg was definitely broken and infection might already be setting in. The children were suffering from severe hunger and cold exposure. If they stayed out here much longer, they would all die. Jake had spent 8 years avoiding people and their problems. He had come to the mountains to get away from exactly this kind of situation. But looking at these 4 desperate people, especially the children, he knew he couldn't just walk away. "Okay," he said, mostly to himself. "Okay." Jake moved very slowly, like he was approaching scared wild animals. He took off his heavy winter coat and held it out toward them. The woman flinched, but Jake just laid the coat on the ground and stepped back. "For the kids," he said, pointing to the children and then to the coat. "Keep them warm." The little girl seemed to understand. She carefully reached for the coat and wrapped it around her younger brothers. The oldest boy immediately stopped shivering. As much. Now Jake was getting cold quickly in just his shirt, but he ignored it. He pointed to himself and said, "Jake." Then he pointed to the woman and raised his eyebrows, asking for her name. The woman looked confused and scared, but the little girl understood. She pointed to her mother and said, "Mama." Then she pointed to herself and said, "Ming." She pointed to the middle boy and said, "Wei," and to the youngest and said, "Bao." "Ming Wei Bao," Jake repeated, nodding. "Good names." Jake then pointed toward where his cabin was hidden in the trees. "House," he said. "Warm house. Food." He rubbed his stomach and pretended to eat to show what he meant. The woman, who Jake decided to call Mrs. Chen in his head since he didn't know her real name, shook her head frantically. She was still convinced that Jake was dangerous. But Ming, the oldest girl, was smart enough to realize they didn't have many choices. Ming spoke to her mother in rapid Chinese. Jake could tell it was an argument. The mother was afraid, but Ming was trying to convince her of something. Finally, Ming looked at Jake and said, "You help? Really help?" "Yeah," Jake said, "really help, but we need to go now, too cold." Jake could see that Mrs. Chen was getting weaker. Her lips were turning blue and she was having trouble staying conscious. The children weren't much better. They needed warmth and food immediately, or they would start dying within hours. Without waiting for more permission, Jake gently picked up the youngest boy, Bao. The child was so light it scared Jake. When was the last time this kid had eaten a real meal? Ming said something to her mother, and Mrs. Chen nodded weakly. Jake helped Ming and Wei support their mother on either side. Mrs. Chen couldn't put any weight on her broken leg, so they had to half carry her. The walk back to Jake's cabin was slow and difficult. Jake carried Bao the whole way, and the little boy fell asleep in his arms. Mrs. Chen had to stop every few minutes to rest, and Jake could see she was in terrible pain. But somehow they made it. When Jake's cabin came into view, Ming's eyes got wide. To her it probably looked like a palace. The cabin was warm, dry, and safe. Jake quickly got everyone inside and immediately started building up the fire. The cabin was small but comfortable. Jake had built most of the furniture himself over the years. There was a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, 1 bedroom, and a bathroom. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and solid. As soon as they got inside, all 4 of his unexpected guests seemed to collapse. Mrs. Chen sat on Jake's couch and immediately started shivering uncontrollably as her body began to warm up. The children, huddled together near the fireplace. Jake looked at this family that had suddenly appeared in his life. He had no idea who they were, where they came from, or how they had ended up half dead in the Montana wilderness. He didn't speak their language, and they barely spoke his. But as he watched Bao sleeping peacefully for the first time in who knows how long, and saw the relief in Ming's eyes as she felt real warmth, Jake knew his life had just changed completely. The first night was the hardest. Jake had gotten the family inside his cabin and started a big fire, but Mrs. Chen was in serious trouble. Her broken leg was swollen and hot to the touch, which meant infection was setting in. In the wilderness, without proper medical care, that could easily kill her. Jake looked through his first aid supplies. He had basic stuff, bandages, pain medicine, and some antibiotics he kept for emergencies. But he wasn't a doctor. He had learned basic first aid during his construction days, and living alone in the mountains had taught him to handle injuries. But this was beyond anything he had dealt with before. Mrs. Chen kept slipping in and out of consciousness. When she was awake, she would look at Jake with pure terror in her eyes. She still thought he might hurt her family. Even though he had brought them to safety, she couldn't trust him. Ming stayed close to her mother, holding her hand and speaking, softly in Chinese. The little girl was trying to be brave, but Jake could see she was scared. Wei, the middle boy, sat quietly in the corner, watching everything with big eyes, and little Bao was so weak he could barely keep his eyes open. Jake heated up some canned soup and brought it over to the children. Ming immediately became protective, stepping between Jake and her brothers. She took the bowl carefully, like she expected it might be poisoned. "It's okay," Jake said gently. "Just soup." "Good soup." Ming tasted it first, then helped her brothers eat. They were so hungry they could barely control themselves. But Ming was smart enough to make sure they ate slowly. Jake had seen what happened when starving people ate too much too fast. It could make them very sick. While the children ate, Jake focused on Mrs. Chen. Her leg needed to be set properly, or it would heal wrong and she would never walk normally again. But moving it was going to cause her incredible pain. Jake tried to explain what he needed to do, but Mrs. Chen didn't understand English. He pointed to her leg, then made gestures showing that he needed to straighten it. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with panic. She started saying, "Buyao, buyao," over and over again, which Jake figured meant, "No, no." Ming came over and saw what Jake was trying to explain. The 9-year-old girl had to make a decision that no child should ever have to make. She could see that her mother was getting sicker, but she also knew that Jake was a stranger who might hurt them. "Mama," Ming said in Chinese, then switched to English. "He want help. Mama leg very bad." Mrs. Chen grabbed Ming's hand and spoke rapidly in Chinese. Jake could tell she was giving instructions, probably telling Ming to take care of her brothers if something happened to her. Finally, Mrs. Chen looked at Jake and nodded slightly. She understood that without help, she was going to die anyway. Jake worked as carefully as he could. He had to straighten Mrs. Chen's leg and make a splint to hold it in place. Mrs. Chen bit down on a piece of wood to keep from screaming, but tears streamed down her face from the pain. Ming held her mother's hand and spoke softly to her the whole time. Jake was amazed by how brave this little girl was. She was only 9 years old, but she was acting like an adult, taking care of her whole family. When Jake finished with the splint, Mrs. Chen had passed out from the pain. Jake covered her with blankets and gave her some of his strongest pain medicine. Now all they could do was wait and hope the infection didn't get worse. The children fell asleep on Jake's couch, all 3 of them piled together like puppies. Jake sat in his chair and watched them sleep. In 24 hours, his quiet life had completely changed. Yesterday, the biggest problem in his world was whether he had caught enough rabbits for dinner. Now he was responsible for keeping 4 people alive. Over the next few days, Jake learned more about his unexpected guests through gestures, simple words, and Ming's growing English vocabulary. The little girl was incredibly smart and picked up new words quickly. Jake learned that they had been walking in the mountains for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. In February. It was amazing they were still alive. They had been eating whatever they could find: berries, bark, melted snow. They slept under trees and in small caves, huddling together to stay warm. But why were they out there in the first place? That was the mystery Jake couldn't figure out. Ming's English wasn't good enough to explain complicated things, and Mrs. Chen was too sick to talk much. Slowly, though, pieces of the story came together. Jake learned that they were from China. They had been traveling for a long time, not just the 3 weeks in the mountains. Mrs. Chen would sometimes say words like afraid and police and run away. Jake began to understand that this family were refugees. They had run away from China for some reason and were trying to get somewhere safe, but something had gone wrong, and they ended up lost and alone in the Montana wilderness. Mrs. Chen's fever got worse before it got better. For 2 days, Jake thought she might die. She would mumble in Chinese and try to get up to go somewhere, but she was too weak to even sit up properly. Ming never left her mother's side, bringing her water and talking to her in their language. Jake did everything he could think of. He gave Mrs. Chen antibiotics and pain medicine. He changed the bandages on her leg every day. He made her drink lots of water and try to eat small amounts of food. On the 3rd day, Mrs. Chen's fever finally broke. When she woke up, she looked around Jake's cabin like she was seeing it for the first time. Then she looked at Jake, and for the first time there wasn't fear in her eyes. There was something else, confusion, maybe even gratitude. Mrs. Chen said something in Chinese to Ming. Ming smiled, the first real smile Jake had seen from any of them. "Mama say thank you," Ming told Jake. "She say sorry for scared." Jake nodded. "Tell her it's okay. Anyone would be scared." But even though Mrs. Chen was getting better, Jake could see that she was still worried about something. She would look toward the door of the cabin like she expected someone to come looking for them. Sometimes she would have nightmares and wake up calling out in Chinese. The children were recovering faster than their mother. Wei started following Jake around the cabin, watching everything he did. The boy was curious about Jake's tools, his books, and especially his hunting equipment, but he was still very quiet and jumpy. Loud noises made him hide behind his sister. Little Bao was getting stronger every day. He had been the sickest when Jake found them, but children recover quickly when they're properly fed and kept warm. Soon he was crawling around the cabin and getting into everything, just like a normal 4-year-old. Ming was the one who amazed Jake the most. Every day she learned more English words. She would point to things around the cabin and ask, "What, this?" Jake would tell her, and she would repeat the word until she got it right. Soon she could ask for food, water, and help with simple things. But Ming was also carrying a heavy responsibility. She was the translator for her family, the one who had to make decisions when her mother was too sick. Sometimes Jake would see her crying quietly when she thought no one was looking. This little girl had grown up too fast. One evening, about a week after Jake had found them, Mrs. Chen managed to walk a few steps with a stick Jake had made for her. She was still very weak, but she was determined to start moving around. She came over to where Jake was sitting by the fire and slowly sat down next to him. For a few minutes, they just sat there in silence. Then Mrs. Chen spoke. "Thank you," she said in English. Her pronunciation was careful and slow, but clear. Jake looked at her. "You're welcome." Mrs. Chen pointed to herself and said, "Li Hua." Then she pointed to her children and said their names again. Ming, Wei, Bao. So her name was Li Hua. Jake nodded and pointed to himself. "Jake." Li Hua repeated his name, trying to get the pronunciation right. "Jake. Good man, Jake." That night, for the first time since he had found them, Li Hua and her children slept peacefully. They were still afraid of what might happen next, but they were no longer afraid of Jake. Jake lay in his bed. He had given the family his bedroom and was sleeping on the couch and listened to the quiet breathing of his unexpected guests. A week ago, these people had thought he was going to kill them. Now they trusted him enough to sleep safely in his home. Jake had spent 8 years avoiding people and their problems. He had convinced himself that humans were selfish, dishonest, and not worth his time. But watching this family fight to survive, seeing how they took care of each other even when they had nothing, was changing his mind. Li Hua had risked everything to protect her children. Ming had put herself between danger and her little brothers. Even Wei, just 7 years old, shared his food with Bao without being asked. Maybe Jake had been wrong about people. Maybe he had just been around the wrong people. These 4 strangers had brought something into his cabin that had been missing for 8 years, the feeling that life was about more than just surviving. They had reminded him what it meant to be part of a family. As Jake finally fell asleep, he wondered what would happen next. Li Hua was getting stronger, but she still couldn't travel. The children were healthy now, but they had nowhere to go. Winter wasn't over yet, and even if it was, Jake still didn't understand how this family had ended up lost in the Montana wilderness. One thing was certain, though. Jake's life would never be the same again. The mountain man who had wanted nothing to do with people had become the most important person in the world to 3 children and their mother. 2 weeks had passed since Jake found the family, and his cabin felt like a completely different place. What had been a quiet, lonely space was now filled with the sounds of children playing, Li Hua humming while she mended clothes, and conversations, in 2 languages that somehow managed to make sense. Jake had never realized how silent his life had been until it wasn't silent anymore. Wei would wake up early and try to help Jake make breakfast, even though the 7-year-old boy could barely reach the stove. Bao had claimed Jake's favorite chair as his own and would sit there every morning, watching Jake with curious eyes. And Ming had appointed herself as the family's official English student, asking Jake to teach her new words every day. Li Hua was walking better now, though she still needed her walking stick. More importantly, she had stopped looking at the door, like she expected danger to burst through it at any moment. She was beginning to trust that Jake's cabin was truly safe, but Jake knew they couldn't stay forever. Spring was still months away, but eventually, this family would need to find a permanent home. The problem was, Jake still didn't understand their whole story. Where had they come from? Where were they trying to go? And why had they been wandering alone in the wilderness? The breakthrough came on a snowy Thursday morning. Jake was teaching Ming how to read from one of his old books when Li Hua came over and sat down with them. She had been listening to the English lessons every day, and Jake could tell she was understanding more than she let on. Ming, Li Hua said in Chinese, then looked at Jake. Ming, tell story. Our story. Jake put down the book. Okay, I'd like to hear your story. Ming looked nervous. She was only 9 years old, and telling their family's story in a language she was still learning was a big responsibility. But she took a deep breath and began. We from China, Ming started. Mama work make clothes. Baba. She stopped and looked sad. Baba write newspaper, write truth about government. Jake nodded encouragingly. Ming's father had been a journalist who wrote about the government. That could be dangerous in some countries. Government angry with Baba. Ming continued. They take Baba away. Put in jail. We very scared. Li Hua reached over and took Ming's hand, giving her strength to continue. Mama sell everything. We run away at night. Go Hong Kong first, then. Ming struggled to find the words. Then boat. Very bad boat. Many people. Sick. Jake was starting to understand. This family were refugees who had escaped from China. They had come to America by boat, probably paying smugglers to bring them across the ocean. Boat come to America, Ming went on. But not good place. Dark place. Bad men take us in truck. Drive many days. Jake felt his anger rising. Human smugglers. People who made money by bringing desperate families to America illegally, often treating them terribly and abandoning them when things got dangerous. Truck stop in mountains, Ming said. Bad men say we walk. They say someone meet us, take us to family in California. But Mama hurt leg when we walk. Fall down big rock. Now Jake understood what had happened. The smugglers had dumped this family in the middle of the Montana wilderness, telling them someone would meet them and take them the rest of the way to California. But Li Hua had been injured, and no one ever came. We wait many days, Ming continued, her voice getting quieter. No one come. Food gone. Very cold. We think we die. Li Hua said something in Chinese, and Ming nodded. Mama say thank you again. She say you save our life. Jake looked at this brave little girl who had just told him about her family's terrible journey. They had lost everything: their home, their father, their country. They had survived a dangerous ocean crossing and been abandoned by the very people who were supposed to help them. And through it all, Li Hua had protected her children, and the children had taken care of each other. "Where in California?" Jake asked. "Where were you trying to go?" Ming spoke to her mother in Chinese, then turned back to Jake. "Mama have sister in San Francisco. Sister write letter, say come to America. Say she help us." Jake knew San Francisco. It was about 800 miles from his cabin. In good weather with a reliable car, it would take about 12 hours to drive there. But it might as well have been on the moon for a family with no money, no papers, and no way to travel. "Do you have your sister's address?" Jake asked. Li Hua nodded and carefully pulled a wrinkled piece of paper from her pocket. She had been carrying her sister's letter the whole time, through the boat trip, the truck ride, and 3 weeks in the wilderness. Jake looked at the address. It was in Chinatown, which made sense. Li Hua's sister had probably been in America for a while and had built a life there. "Maybe I can help you contact your sister," Jake said. "When I go to town next time, I can use the phone." Ming translated for her mother, and Li Hua's eyes filled with tears. She said something in Chinese that sounded like a prayer of gratitude. But Jake knew it wouldn't be that simple. Even if they could contact Li Hua's sister, how would the family get to California? They had no legal documents, no money, and no way to travel safely. If they were caught by immigration officers, they would be sent back to China, where Li Hua's husband was in prison, and their lives would be in danger. Over the next few days, Jake found himself thinking about their problem constantly. He had saved their lives, but now what? He couldn't keep them hidden in his cabin forever. They needed real help, legal help, from people who understood immigration law. During this time, Jake watched how the family functioned together, and it amazed him. Li Hua was clearly the head of the family, making decisions and keeping everyone safe. But each child had their own role too. Ming was the responsible one, always helping her mother and watching out for her younger brothers. She had learned enough English now to have real conversations with Jake, and she was incredibly smart. Jake could see that before their father was taken away, Ming had probably been an excellent student. Wei was the quiet observer. He didn't talk much, but he paid attention to everything. Jake noticed that Wei had memorized Jake's daily routine and would have tools ready before Jake even asked for them. The boy was also incredibly gentle with his little brother, always making sure Bao had enough food and helping him when he struggled with something. Bao was too young to understand everything that had happened to his family, but he was a tough, little kid. Jake was amazed by how quickly Bao had bounced back from near starvation. Now he spent his days exploring every corner of the cabin and trying to help with everything Jake did. Li Hua herself was remarkable. Despite everything she had been through, losing her husband, fleeing her country, nearly dying in the mountains, she had never given up. Even when she was delirious with fever, she had been trying to protect her children. Jake had never spent much time around children before, and he was surprised by how much he enjoyed it. Wei's quiet questions about how things worked, Ming's determination to learn new English words, Bao's laughter when Jake showed him how to whittle wood. For the first time in 8 years, Jake's cabin felt like a home instead of just a hiding place. But the more attached Jake became to this family, the more he worried about their future. Winter was far from over. Even if they could contact Li Hua's sister, it would be months before travel was safe. And that was assuming they could figure out a way to travel without being caught. One evening, while Li Hua was helping the children get ready for bed, Jake made a decision. Tomorrow he would make the trip to town. Not just for supplies, but to use the phone and try to help this family contact their relatives in California. Jake had been avoiding people for 8 years, but for Li Hua, Ming, Wei, and Bao, he was willing to venture back into the world he had left behind. As he watched Li Hua tuck her children into bed, speaking softly to them in Chinese, Jake realized something important. This family had already given him more than he could ever give them. They had reminded him that there was goodness in the world, that people could be brave and kind and loyal even when everything seemed hopeless. Jake Roberts had thought he was saving 4 strangers from freezing to death in the mountains. But really, they had saved him from freezing to death in his own heart. The next morning, as Jake prepared for his trip to town, Ming came up to him with a serious expression on her face. "Jake," she said, using his name carefully like she always did. "Mama say something." "What does she say?" Ming spoke to her mother, then turned back to Jake. "She say you good man. She say in China we have saying, when someone save your life, they responsible for you forever. But also you become family." Jake looked over at Li Hua, who nodded at him and said something in Chinese. "Mama say you are family now," Ming translated. "We your family. Forever." Jake felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. It took him a moment to recognize what it was. It was the feeling of belonging somewhere, of being needed and wanted by people who mattered. "Tell your mama," Jake said quietly, "that I'm honored to be part of your family." As Jake loaded his truck for the trip to town, he knew that whatever happened next, his life had been permanently changed. The mountain man who had wanted nothing to do with people had found his way back to humanity through 4 strangers who had reminded him what family really meant. The trip to town took Jake longer than usual because the winter roads were covered with ice and snow. But he had an important mission. At the general store, he bought extra food, warm clothes for the children, and some basic school supplies so Ming could continue learning to read and write in English. Most importantly, he used the payphone at the gas station to call the number on Li Hua's sister's letter. His hands were actually shaking as he dialed. Jake hadn't made a phone call to a stranger in years, and he wasn't sure what he would say. The phone rang 4 times before a woman answered. "Wei," she said, which Jake figured meant hello in Chinese. Hello," Jake said. "Do you speak English?" "Yes, little bit," the woman said. "Who this?" "My name is Jake. I'm calling about your sister, Li Hua, and her children." There was complete silence on the other end of the phone. Then Jake heard the woman gasp, "Li Hua? My sister Li Hua? Where is she? Is she okay?" Jake could hear the desperation in the woman's voice. "She's safe. She and the children are safe. They're with me." What followed was a conversation that changed everything. The woman's name was Li Mei, and she had been waiting for her sister for over a year. Li Hua had written to say they were coming to America, but then Li Mei had heard nothing for months. "I call police, I call everyone," Li Mei said, her English getting better as she got more excited. "No one know where they are. I think maybe they dead." Jake explained what had happened, how he had found the family in the mountains, how they had been abandoned by smugglers, how Li Hua had been injured. Li Mei cried as she listened. "They safe now?" Li Mei asked. "Really safe?" "Yes," Jake said. "They're healing. But Li Mei, they need help. Legal help. They don't have papers." Li Mei was quiet for a moment. "I know lawyer. Good lawyer. He help. Many families like us. But they need come to San Francisco. That was the problem. How could a family with no legal status travel 800 miles without being caught?" "Let me think about it," Jake said. "Can I call you again?" Li Mei gave him her phone number and made Jake promise to take good care of her sister. When Jake hung up the phone, he felt like he had started something that he didn't know how to finish. When Jake got back to the cabin, the family was waiting for him. Li Hua looked nervous. She could tell from Jake's face that something important had happened. "I talked to your sister," Jake told Ming, who immediately translated for her mother, Li. Hua's reaction was immediate and powerful. She started crying and speaking rapidly in Chinese. Ming was crying too, and even the boys seemed to understand that something wonderful had happened. Mama asked, "Sister okay?" Ming said through her tears. "Yes, she's okay. She's been very worried about you. She thought you might be dead." For the next hour, Jake told them everything Li Mei had said, that she had a good job in a restaurant, that she had been saving money to help her sister, that she knew a lawyer who might be able to help with their immigration case. But Jake also had to explain the problem. They were still in the middle of winter. The roads were dangerous, and it was too risky to try to travel to California right now. They would have to wait for spring. Li Hua listened to everything through Ming's translation, then spoke to her daughter for several minutes. "Mama say we wait," Ming told Jake. "She say better to be safe with you than sorry on road." So they settled in for a longer stay. Jake realized that these 4 people would be living in his cabin for at least 2 more months, maybe 3. The idea should have worried him. Instead, he found himself looking forward to it. Over the following weeks, Jake's cabin became a real home. Li Hua took over most of the cooking, and Jake was amazed by how she could make delicious meals from simple ingredients. She also fixed his clothes, cleaned the cabin better than it had ever been cleaned, and somehow made everything feel warmer and more comfortable. The children fell into their own routines. Ming continued her English lessons with Jake every morning. She was learning so fast that Jake had to go to town again to buy more books. Soon she was reading simple stories and could have conversations about complex topics. Wei became Jake's apprentice. The quiet boy followed Jake everywhere, learning how to repair things, how to hunt, and how to take care of the cabin. Wei was naturally good with tools, and Jake enjoyed teaching him practical skills. Bao was everyone's entertainment. The 4-year-old had completely recovered from his ordeal and was now a bundle of energy. He would help his mother cook by making messes. He would help Jake with repairs by losing the screws. And he would help his siblings with their lessons by asking a million questions. But what surprised Jake the most was how much he enjoyed the noise and chaos. For years he had thought he wanted peace and quiet. Now he realized that what he had actually wanted was peace of mind. And somehow, taking care of this family had given him exactly that. The family also brought new traditions to the cabin. Li Hua taught Jake how to celebrate Chinese New Year, which fell in late February. She made dumplings from scratch and explained what each tradition meant. The children performed a little dance they had learned in China, and Li Hua told stories about their ancestors. Jake shared his own traditions too. He taught them how to tap maple trees for syrup. He showed them how to identify different animal tracks in the snow. And he told them stories about his childhood, things he hadn't thought about in years. One evening in March, as they sat around the fire after dinner, Ming asked Jake a question that caught him off guard. "Jake, you have family?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "I was married once, but we got divorced. No children." Ming translated for her mother, and Li Hua asked her own question. "Mama asked, you lonely before we come?" Jake had never really thought about it that way. "Yes," he said finally. "I was very lonely. I just didn't realize it." Li Hua said something else, and Ming smiled as she translated. "Mama say now, you not lonely. Now you have us." It was true. Jake couldn't imagine going back to his old life of silence and solitude. These 4 people had become the most important part of his world. But Jake also knew that their time together was limited. Spring was coming, and when the roads cleared, the family would have to continue their journey to California. Li Hua belonged with her sister, and the children needed to go to school and build normal lives. The thought of saying goodbye to them made Jake's chest tight with sadness. But he also knew that helping them reach safety was the right thing to do, even if it meant being alone again. In early April, when the snow finally started melting seriously, Jake made another trip to town. This time, he called Li Mei again and started making plans for the family's trip to California. Li Mei had been busy. She had talked to the lawyer, who said he could help Li Hua and the children apply for asylum if they could prove they had fled political persecution in China. Li Mei had also found a small apartment where the family could live and had arranged for the children to be enrolled in school, but they still had the problem of how to travel safely. The family had no legal documents, and if they were stopped by police during the 800-mile trip, they could be arrested and deported. Jake spent a lot of time thinking about this problem. Finally, he came up with a plan that was risky, but might work. When he got back to the cabin, he called a family meeting. Li Hua, Ming, Wei, and Bao all sat around his kitchen table while Jake explained what he had decided. "I'm going to drive you to California myself," he said. Ming's eyes went wide as she translated for her mother. Li Hua immediately started shaking her head and speaking rapidly in Chinese. Mama say no, Ming told Jake. She say too dangerous for you. If police catch us, you get in trouble too. Jake had thought about that. Helping people without legal documents could get him arrested, but he had also thought about what would happen to this family if they tried to make the trip alone. Ming, Jake said. Tell your mother that families help each other. And we're family now, right? Ming translated, and Li Hua's eyes filled with tears. She reached across the table and took Jake's hands in hers. She spoke for a long time in Chinese, and Ming had to wipe her own eyes before she could translate. Mama say you best man in world. She say she never forget what you do for us. She say our children will tell their children about Jake who save us. Jake looked around the table at these 4 people who had changed his life completely. Li Hua, who had protected her children through impossible circumstances. Ming, who had grown up too fast but never lost her kindness. Wei, who watched everything and understood more than he said. And Bao, who had brought laughter back into Jake's world. When do we leave? Ming asked. Jake thought about it. The roads would be completely clear in another week or 2. Soon, he said. Very soon. That night, as Jake lay in his bed, he thought about the journey ahead. It would be dangerous, and there was no guarantee they wouldn't get caught. But Jake knew he had to try. This family had trusted him with their lives. Now he had to trust himself to get them to safety. Outside his window, Jake could hear the sounds of spring arriving. Birds were singing, snow was melting, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of water running as the streams filled with snowmelt. Winter was ending, and with it, the most meaningful months of Jake's life. Soon, he would have to say goodbye to the family that had become his whole world. But first he had one more job to do. He had to make sure they reached their new life safely. The day finally came in late April when Jake decided the roads were safe enough for the trip to California. The family had been with him for over 2 months, and his cabin had become their home. But everyone knew it was time to continue their journey to Li Hua's sister. Jake spent several days preparing for the trip. He bought a more reliable truck, a used pickup that could handle the long drive and had enough room for all 5 of them. He studied maps carefully, choosing routes that avoided major highways where there might be immigration checkpoints. Most importantly, Jake tried to think of a story that would explain why he was traveling with a Chinese family. He decided to say they were friends from when he worked construction, and that he was helping them move to California for a new job. It wasn't completely true, but it wasn't completely false either. Li Hua was nervous about the trip. Her English had improved a lot during their months together, but she was still worried about what would happen if they were stopped by police. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear he had seen that first day when he found them in the forest. It's going to be okay, Jake told her. We'll be careful, Ming translated, and Li Hua nodded. But Jake knew she was thinking about her husband, still in prison in China. This family had already lost so much. They couldn't afford to lose anything more. The night before they left, Jake couldn't sleep. He walked around his cabin, looking at all the changes the family had made. Li Hua's sewing basket in the corner, the children's drawings taped to the walls, extra blankets and pillows that had turned his lonely space into a real home. Tomorrow, his cabin would be empty again. The silence that Jake had once loved now seemed terrifying. In the morning, as they loaded their few belongings into the truck, each family member said goodbye to the cabin in their own way. Bao ran from room to room, touching everything one last time. Wei carefully put away the tools Jake had taught him to use. Ming stood in the doorway of her bedroom, looking around like she was trying to memorize every detail. Li Hua walked around, the cabin slowly touching the furniture Jake had made, the fireplace that had kept them warm, the kitchen table where they had shared so many meals. When she finished her circle, she came over to Jake and pressed something into his hand. It was a small jade pendant on a thin chain. The jade was smooth and green, carved into the shape of a dragon. Family protection, Li Hua said in her careful English. My grandmother give me. Now I give you. Jake looked down at the pendant. He could tell it was very old, and probably very valuable. More than that, he could tell it meant everything to Li Hua. "I can't take this," Jake said. "It's too important." Li Hua shook her head firmly. "You family now. Family protect family." Jake put the pendant around his neck. It felt warm against his chest, like it carried some of the love this family had brought into his life. The drive to California took 2 days. Jake had planned stops at small motels in little towns where they were less likely to attract attention. The family stayed quiet during the drive, especially when they passed state troopers or went through small cities. But mostly the trip was peaceful. They drove through beautiful countryside as spring bloomed across the western states. The children played simple games and slept in the back seat. Li Hua sat next to Jake in the front, pointing out interesting things they saw and asking him questions about America. Jake found himself dreading their arrival in San Francisco. Every mile brought them closer to goodbye. On the second day, they drove through the mountains of Northern California, Ming asked Jake a question that surprised him. "Jake, you come visit us?" Jake looked in the rearview mirror at the little girl who had become like a daughter to him. "If your aunt says it's okay." "Mama already asked Aunt Li Mei," Ming said. "She say you always welcome. She say you family too now." Jake felt his throat get tight. These people had already given him so much. Now they were offering him a permanent place in their lives. When they finally reached San Francisco, Jake followed Li Mei's directions to Chinatown. The neighborhood was busy and colorful, full of Chinese signs and restaurants and shops. Jake had never seen anything like it. Li Mei's restaurant was small but welcoming. When their truck pulled up outside, a woman came running out before they had even stopped. Jake knew immediately that this was Li Hua's sister. She had the same kind face and the same determined way of moving. What happened next was something Jake would never forget. Li Hua slowly got out of the truck, still using her walking stick. For a moment, the two sisters just looked at each other. Then they both started crying and rushed into each other's arms. Ming Wei and Bao piled out of the truck and joined the family hug. Jake stood back, watching this reunion he had helped make possible. Li Mei was touching her sister's face like she couldn't believe Li Hua was really there. She was hugging the children and speaking rapidly in Chinese. Finally, Li Mei turned to Jake. She was a small woman, but when she looked at him, Jake felt like she could see right into his soul. "You Jake?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." Li Mei walked over to Jake and without any warning hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing my family home." Jake felt tears in his own eyes. "Thank you for giving me a family to bring home." Li Mei insisted that Jake stay for dinner. The restaurant was closed that evening, so Li Mei cooked. A feast for her sister's family and the man who had saved them. Jake had never tasted food so delicious or sat at a table filled with so much happiness. During dinner, Li Hua told her sister their whole story. Jake couldn't understand the Chinese, but he could tell from Li Mei's reactions that she was hearing about their escape from China, their terrible journey across the ocean, their abandonment in the mountains, and their rescue by a stranger who became family. When Li Hua finished her story, Li Mei turned to Jake. "My sister say you angel. Say you appear in forest like gift from heaven." Jake shook his head. "I'm not an angel. I'm just a guy who was in the right place at the right time. Maybe," Li Mei said. "But maybe heaven put you in right place at right time." After dinner, Li Mei showed them the small apartment she had prepared. It was tiny, but clean and warm. There were beds for everyone and a small kitchen where Li Hua could cook. Most importantly, it was safe. Jake helped carry their few belongings upstairs. As he looked around the little apartment that would be their new home, he felt proud and sad at the same time. Proud that he had helped this family reach safety, sad that his time with them was ending. Li Mei had already arranged for the children to start school the following week. Ming would be in 4th grade, Wei in 2nd grade, and Bao would go to preschool. Li Mei had also set up an appointment with the immigration lawyer who would help them apply for asylum. That night, Jake stayed in a small hotel near Chinatown. He lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the city, and thought about his empty cabin waiting for him in Montana. The next morning, before Jake left for home, the whole family gathered in Li Mei's restaurant to say goodbye. Jake had been dreading this moment for weeks, but somehow it felt right. This family belonged here, with Li Mei, in a community where they could rebuild their lives. Ming was the first to say goodbye. She hugged Jake tightly and said, "Thank you for teaching me English. Thank you for teaching me that America has good people." Wei, still quiet but braver now, shook Jake's hand like a little man. "Thank you for teaching me tools," he said in his careful English. Bao, who was too young to really understand that Jake was leaving, just wanted to be picked up and hugged. "Bye-bye, Jake," he said happily. Li Hua's goodbye was the hardest. She took Jake's hands in hers and spoke in Chinese. For a long time, Ming translated. "Mama say you save our life, but more than that. She say you give us hope. She say before we meet you, we think maybe all people in world bad people. But you show us good people still exist." Li Hua reached up and touched the jade pendant hanging around Jake's neck. She said something else in Chinese. "Mama say dragon will protect you always. And she say our family will never forget you. Never." Finally, Li Mei walked Jake to his truck. "You always have family here," she said. "You understand always?" Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As Jake drove out of San Francisco, he looked in his rearview mirror and saw the family waving from the restaurant steps. Ming was holding Bao, Wei was standing close to his mother, and Li Hua had her arm around Li Mei. They looked like they belonged there, like they were finally home. The drive back to Montana took Jake 2 days, just like the trip to California. But this time, he was alone with his thoughts. He thought about everything that had happened since that February morning when he heard crying in the forest, how 4 strangers had changed his life completely, how he had learned what it meant to be part of a family again. When Jake finally reached his cabin, it felt strange to walk through the door. Everything was exactly as they had left it, but it felt empty in a way it never had before. Jake sat in his chair by the fireplace and listened to the silence. For the first time in 8 years, Jake Roberts felt truly alone. But it was a different kind of alone than before. Before, Jake had been hiding from life. Now he was alone because he had chosen to help 4 people find their way to a better life. The silence felt sad, but it also felt proud.